As many watching may know, President Trump has now followed through on his promise to invoke 25% tariffs on Canada. And just yesterday, Canada's leader had a swift reply of retaliation of dollar for dollar tariffs on the US. The situation is escalating and largely still developing. And as somebody living in Canada, as a Canadian, I have my own thoughts, and I wanted to share what I'm seeing with friends, with family, and on the ground of this event. Let's jump right in. For many of you watching, you'll know that I just hopped off a live stream earlier today talking about this, and there was a lot of positive attention. So I thought I would formalize some of my thoughts and focus on a few key topics around this event. It's different from the normal type of content that I make, but I think it's relevant now more than ever, and definitely top of mind for all Canadians who might be watching this. And one more thing I will add is I am not trying to politicize this matter any more than it should be, nor am I trying to villainize anybody. I am trying to make it as fact based as I possibly can and try to add some value for people who might just try to be piecing it together. Now, I'll play a clip of Justin Trudeau and his response to the Trump tariffs, and this is exactly what he said last night.
Canada will be responding to the U.S. trade action with 25% tariffs against $155 billion worth of American goods. This will include immediate tariffs on $30 billion worth of goods as of Tuesday, followed by further tariffs on $125 billion worth of American products in 21 days' time to allow Canadian companies and supply chains to seek to find alternatives.
And obviously, this response caught me a little bit by surprise because it's so impactful. And just so you get an idea of how impactful this is, I posted this visualization on my X account earlier today around each of the 50 United States' biggest export trading partner. And what you can see in this visualization is that the vast majority of states have Canada as their biggest export trading partner. And much of this is simply attributable to the geography because it's way more lucrative from a logistics point of view to trade with a neighbor than it is to transport goods across an ocean. You can see this with southern states like California, Texas, Arizona, and New Mexico, who have Mexico as their biggest trading partner, and the vast majority of states have Canada as their biggest export trading partner. And the funny part here is because Trump, in one broad swoop motion, applied tariffs on Mexico, Canada, and China, it also impacts the remaining states here that have China as their biggest trading partner. And if you just count out on this chart, the states that don't have China, Mexico, or the US, that leaves you with about 7 states out of 50 that don't have their biggest export trading partner impacted by this decision that the president made. Now, I don't know how long the situation will last, but rhetoric is definitely rising because initially Trump threatened tariffs as a result of a lack of border security investment from Canada. And yesterday, Canadian leadership immediately retaliated with their own tariffs. However, Trump did threaten further tariffs, even potentially doubling the existing 25% if Canada retaliated. So right now, I'm just waiting for the other shoe to drop in the form of more tariffs from the US. I think it's going to get worse before it starts getting better. And the reason is because I don't think either country is going to back down. Trump is not going to back down, and neither will Trudeau, who currently in Canada has one of the lowest approval ratings across the board. And I would suspect the approval rating for that party will rise as a result of this tariff situation and this trade war. And obviously, that's going to be beneficial for his party because we're going into a year where we're going to have an election at the end of 2025. So I really don't think either side is in a rush to de escalate the tension. And that's really going to be unfortunate because for as long as the situation continues, the people that are going to be most hurt are the ordinary consumers in both countries. But obviously, Canada is going to be disproportionately hurt because of the size being 1/10 of the US and because of the dependency with the US. Something like 77% of all trade in Canada is with the US. And that's the thing that makes me most worried is the fact that Canada is disproportionately going to see a hardship felt by the ordinary consumer because this is their biggest trading partner and it's an economy that's 10 times bigger than them. The cost of living for Canadians is going to increase. Likely, you're going to have fewer jobs and more layoffs as a result of many businesses being unable to operate, or it's simply just not going to be economically feasible for them to continue doing business the way that they are. And that in itself will be a shock for the Canadian economy. But not only that, because if we look at it from a deeper lens, the Canadian dollar is massively losing purchasing power relative to the US dollar. And this applies to people across the board because they're getting paid in Canadian dollars. And what makes matters worse is that the government here in Canada has already promised to stimulate the economy and get Canada through this crisis by printing more money and by lowering interest rates at a drastic pace relative to the US and likely handing out money similar to how they did during COVID. Politicians in Canada have already made that playbook very clear, but all that will do is that will further increase inflation up here. It will further devalue the currency, and ultimately it will make the cost of living more expensive. And if you don't agree with me, just look at what happened after COVID. After the money printing, everything became more expensive in grocery stores as a result of that policy. And so that's just going to be a repeat of that policy all over again with a new crisis. And one part of this is just a dangerous rhetoric from both sides. I mean, Trump very clearly telegraphed tariffs while being on the campaign trail, making backhanded comments around Canada becoming a state and around the trade deficit in general. This was rhetoric, but it was also a negotiating tactic that he ended up following through on January 20th when he was elected into power. And tariffs are very clearly an economic threat and an ultimatum with regards to international relations. Because a few weeks ago, Trump played his hand with Colombia, where Colombia essentially refused a plane full of deported migrants from the US. And immediately, Trump ordered 25% tariffs on all Colombian incoming goods, which would be raised to 50% 1 week later if this decision stood. And what happened in that situation was within the same day, in a couple of hours, Colombia agreed to take those migrants and de escalate the situation. And essentially, Trump used it as a negotiating tactic, as economic leverage. And in many ways, this is the same exact thing happening with Canada and with Mexico to justify the trade deficit and to justify the security around the border. And similar to the case of Colombia, there could have been two paths that Canada could have taken. Number one, they could have promised stronger security on the border. They could have promised to work together with the US on the deficit, largely work towards de escalation. Or they could have done what they ended up doing, which was retaliate with tariffs of their own and further increase tensions. The way they retaliated, however, is interesting because what we're reading right now, Canada plans to target red states specifically. Canada even plans to target Tesla specifically, actually calling it out by name, given Elon Musk's ties with Trump.
I would publish a retaliation list. We have huge leverage over the United States because we are their single biggest export market by a long shot.
So the Canadian response is very political, and it's all targeted around putting pressure on Trump's cabinet so as to force Trump to lower those tariffs. Now, like I said, I don't want to make this overly politicized. And to be fair to Canadian leaders, I mean, Trudeau last night even promised $1.3 billion effort to strengthen the border, which is exactly what Trump wanted.
Let's take a moment to talk about our shared border. Our border is already safe and secure, but there's always more work to do. Less than 1% of fentanyl, less than 1% of illegal crossings into the United States come from Canada. But hearing concerns from both Canadians and Americans, including the American president himself, we're taking action. We launched a $1.3 billion border plan that is already showing results, because we too are devastated by the scourge that is fentanyl.
And Trump's response was to make more remarks around this 51st state idea. So even if Canada were fully dedicated to improving the border and were fully dedicated to de-escalation, they would still be running the risks of tariffs, because essentially the tariffs are a stick or an ultimatum that can be then moved to whatever issue he wants to focus on. If he says, hey, you're going to get tariffs for the border, and Canada says, okay, we'll fix the border, later on down the line, he can say, hey, you're going to get tariffs for this other thing that I don't like. And again, force Canada into a rock and a hard place, because it's a battle that they can't win, but they also can't get bullied around by the US. And it's all, I think, in regards to that 51st state idea. But with regards to the 51st state, I think the better way to go about it is to win over the sentiment of Canadians rather than to try to beat them into submission. Because when Trump was making those jokes, I mean, we'll call them jokes for the sake of this video, on the campaign trail, a growing number of Canadians who were just not happy with the current state of affairs in Canada were warming up to the idea that Canada can improve their economy, can improve their dollar, and ultimately can improve people's net worth by joining a stronger economy, by being taxed way less, and just seeing the benefits that that union could have. But now I'm seeing those exact same people being emotionally hurt, and as a result, not even wanting to entertain the thought of becoming a state after being victims as a result of these tariffs. And I think it's just rubbing people off the wrong way. And that's the part that I think is going to have real lasting effects, is this idea that the free trade relationship is so fragile, and the sentiment that Canadians have towards Americans is souring every single day that this trade war goes on. And that's also pushed by our own leaders in this rhetoric around escalation, because that frustration around the cost of living that Canadians had internally directed for the past several years, which resulted in the lowest approval rating ever for the Liberal Party, is now all of a sudden directed externally towards the US. I saw this clip at this hockey game of Canadians, and of all people, Canadians who have an international reputation of being nice people, booing the US national anthem. And I think many people agree with that, because they are rightfully very emotionally charged right now around how these decisions affect their livelihood, around how it affects their expenses, how it affects their cost of living, whether they can make ends meet. And just to present another example, I saw the news around British Columbia now fully taking off US-made liquor off their shelves, even before the tariffs had kicked in. So instead of just allowing consumers to pay more for US goods, they're now taking it on themselves to just full-on boycott products altogether. And if we see much more of that, then obviously this is going to have a bigger impact, because you're not only going to see serious impacts from an economic and societal perspective, but you're also going to see boycotts in addition to tariffs. And that makes matters even worse, because not only does it increase the rhetoric, it escalates the tensions, but regardless of whatever side of the border you're on, for as long as this goes on, it's going to hurt both parties. And this is especially going to hurt Canada, because it also comes at a bad time for Canada, given where they are right now. Parliament is frozen up here in Canada. The government is prorogued right now. So there's no real major decisions that can happen with all members of Parliament not being able to meet. And that in itself, I think, presents a dilemma, because one of the reasons that Parliament is frozen is for the Liberal government to choose a new leader, and there's a changing of the guard, which could present a policy change there. Another reason is because of a no confidence vote, because there's been several no confidence motions in 2024, and we could even have a full on changing of a political party when Parliament does come back later on this year. And not only that, but this trade war affects different provinces in different ways. There's been increasing rhetoric around Alberta, who is generally more right-leaning and has all the oil, who agrees with the US that Canada can be doing a more concerted effort to fix the border. I mean, they could also be threatening to break off altogether. And Quebec, as a province, has also wanted to break off on their own. And these have been long-standing tensions that Canada has had domestically. But what you're having now is a mixture of internal and external politics, because this external pressure is going to put more pressure internally and exacerbate all of these issues that were already existing for the past several years. But ultimately, why I'm not a fan of retaliation as a Canadian is because it's going to lead to more hardship for both sides. Trump is not going to back down. I mean, he's made that very clear. And in his approach in general, I don't think you have to be a political genius to know that he's not going to back down. I don't think Trudeau is going to back down. And so even if the tariffs went to 100% each, it's going to be a game of who cracks first. But the fact of the matter is that Canada is going to feel this more heavily than the US is going to feel it, because our economy is just smaller and our population is just smaller. So even if we put aside for a moment that a war of attrition can hurt both parties, in the end, Canada is going to be hurt much more. So strategically speaking, increasing our rhetoric and making the tensions even worse is, in my opinion, not the most strategically optimal path, because you don't have a path to victory. And when you don't have a path to victory, the best thing you can do is just not fight altogether. But look, I want to stick to just the facts. And I think that Trump is going to have his hands full by spreading himself out way too thin, because he's starting trade wars with so many partners at the same time. Just this week, he imposed tariffs on Canada, on Mexico, and on China at the same time as increasing rhetoric around tariffs on the EU. And all of a sudden, I mean, the US may be an economic superpower, but they're very quickly depriving themselves of alternatives from a trading perspective, because they're alienating every single trading partner simultaneously. Because if the US wants a trading partner that's not Canada, they can go to Mexico or Europe or China. But if they're going to start trade wars with every single partner, and if everybody retaliates at the same time, then the only option that they're going to have is to trade internally in between states. And that's a very risky game to play for the US, because it's a war with everybody at the same time. And that's, I think, the point to consider, because in 2018, when they did a trade war with China, it was very targeted. But this time around, it's more blanket approach, and it's with everybody instead of just one country. And that exacerbates the problem from a US perspective as well. Because yes, many of those countries may fold and may actually give in to Trump's requests, but many of those countries will retaliate and will try to hold off for as long as possible. Now, what happens to stocks? And is this a buy the dip situation? So, very quickly, I want to talk about the market. Monday futures are super red. Tariffs are going to go into effect on Tuesday. So, I think the market pullback is going to continue. I think really the depth of the pullback is going to depend on the length of the trade war. Right now, we're likely to see an escalation. And obviously, that's not great for the market because for as long as this goes on, the uncertainty remains around how aggressively this is going to escalate. I think one good factor from this, from a market perspective, is that it's been telegraphed from the president from a long time, ever since the campaign trail. And I think much of the market has priced this in. So I do think we're going to have a drawdown, and it's really going to depend on how long this is going to go on for. One thing to draw as a parallel here is that in 2018, when the trade war happened between the US and China, the stock market saw a pullback lasting several weeks before bouncing back. So, if this is going to be the same, we're going to see a sustained drawdown lasting several weeks, if not months, if this gets much worse. And in terms of individual stocks, I think everything is going to fall as a blanket. But I think that companies that have direct exposure are going to fall much worse. I made a post earlier today across all major categories with US brands and Canadian alternatives. And what you'll notice is that many of these companies that you see here are publicly traded companies that will fundamentally be hurt by the situation. Because if Kraft or if Coca Cola or if Colgate or if any of these companies start experiencing weaker sales as a result of tariffs, or many companies just might get boycotted altogether, like the liquor companies, for example, then obviously you're going to get a pullback from those companies because their actual fundamentals, their revenue, their earnings are going to get hurt by this event. If you're looking at companies that have absolutely no exposure to Canada, they're just getting pulled down by the rest of the market, then obviously they're going to fall much less and they're going to bounce back much quicker. And then analyzing this, I also wanted to touch very quickly on this dollar milkshake theory because it would explain why the US dollar would remain strong in a time like this. The idea here is that the world is backed by the US dollar, so countries like Canada are disproportionately hurt when these events happen because this is going to hurt both parties. But what Canada is going to do is they're going to provide stimulus, they're going to lower interest rates to rock bottom, they're going to print money to try to help their own economy get out of the situation relatively unscathed and not completely blow up. But because the Canadian dollar is backed by the US dollar, it's going to get further devalued relative to the US dollar because the US dollar is the global reserve currency. It's going to retain the most value. And as a result, it's going to suck up all the excess investable capital from Canada because investors and businesses in Canada are going to see the declining value of the Canadian dollar. And what they're going to do is they're going to move their investments into US equities for safety. And what that does is it increases the US dollar strength against other currencies like the Canadian dollar in this case. And for somebody like myself who has the majority of his wealth in US equities, my main concern is the money that I make from working being devalued and the money that I spend for groceries having less purchasing power because the goods themselves are more expensive and the cost of living is increased. But I don't need to worry too much about my investments losing money as a result of this dollar milkshake theory. But many Canadians have property in Canada. Many Canadians have domestic investments. And so that's a serious concern that can lead to this vicious cycle of investment dollars flooding out of the country and into the US. And from a US perspective, it really matters what the proceeds of this tariff war are used for. Because if the president does, in fact, hold true to his promises by lowering income taxes for Americans, that will obviously funnel many global dollars into the US as well. And you could have a situation where Canada could have a devalued currency, could have more money printing, is just trying to survive with businesses being decimated across the board and people being laid off with massive inflation as a result of money printing. Meanwhile, the US, you have all of this extra disposable income because you no longer have income taxes, or even if they're not eliminated altogether, if you have reduced income taxes, then that obviously excess capital is going to get reinvested in US equities. Now, of course, all that is very speculative and it remains to be seen, but it's just one possible byproduct of the situation if it gets prolonged. Overall, I've tried my best to make this video a measured approach, keeping emotions and politics out of it as much as I possibly can. My stance is I hope it gets de-escalated as soon as possible and resolved as soon as possible, because I think that for as long as this goes on, both sides are going to see pressure. And by both sides, I mean the ordinary working person from both sides. Ultimately, I understand the frustration and the anger felt by so many Canadians towards the US. I think our politicians increasing the rhetoric is not a smart move. I think it obviously helps the approval rating of the party in power to have Canadian anger directed externally rather than internally. But ultimately, all that is going to do is it's going to drag out this trade war far longer than it should if the Canadian response had been to de-escalate. But like I said earlier, there is no guarantee that even if Canada decided to de-escalate and to fix the border, that Trump would not have forced their hand and made this about some other issue and kept the tariffs on. So politicians in Canada, I think, were forced into a corner where they were damned if they de-escalated and they're damned if they escalate even further. So I don't want to take the side of saying that our politicians are entirely at fault. It's just a bad situation all around to be in. And ultimately, it's going to be the people who face the brunt of those repercussions. I'm not here to take sides and who's right and who's wrong. I'm just trying my best to acknowledge both sides equally and where we can go from here. And like I said, I think my stance is very clear in hoping that we get de-escalation and we get this situation resolved as soon as possible for both sides. I hope this video gave you an interesting perspective and made you think. Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. And thank you so much for watching. And if you're new to the channel, please consider subscribing for more content. Thank you so much.